It was a morning like any other, or so I thought. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and I was halfway through my first cup of coffee, still basking in the delusion that life was, if not perfect, at least tolerable. That's when I saw it. A hole. Not just any hole, mind you. A gaping, jagged portal to the great unknown right there in the middle of my living room ceiling. It wasn't just a hole. It was the hole. The kind of architectural disaster that makes you question every decision you've ever made, starting with buying a house under the jurisdiction of an HOA. Now, let's get one thing straight. I'm not a handyman. My toolbox consists of duct tape, a hammer I borrowed from my neighbor 3 years ago, sorry, Steve, and a YouTube playlist titled Fixing Stuff for Dummies. So when I looked up and saw daylight streaming through what used to be a perfectly solid ceiling, my first thought wasn't, how do I fix this? It was more along the lines of, who can I sue? For a moment, I stood there in stunned silence, coffee mug frozen mid-sip. Then gravity kicked in, literally. A chunk of drywall the size of a small pizza broke loose and plummeted to the floor, narrowly missing my cat, Mr. Whiskers. He gave me a look that said, "This is why I don't trust you," and sauntered off to find a less apocalyptic corner of the house. I did what any rational adult would do in this situation. I panicked. Running around the house in my pajamas, I checked every room for more signs of impending collapse. Thankfully, the hole seemed to be an isolated incident. But as I stood there staring up at it, this gaping wound in the fabric of my suburban dreams, I couldn't help but wonder, how did this happen? And more importantly, who was going to pay for it? Enter the HOA. For those lucky enough to have avoided this particular brand of suburban tyranny, HOA stands for Homeowners Association. In theory, they're supposed to maintain community standards and protect property values. In practice, they're a group of overzealous busybodies who will fine you $50 for leaving your trash can out an hour too long, but somehow manage to overlook a giant hole in your ceiling. I grabbed my phone and called the HOA hotline, a number I had saved under the name Satan's Customer Service. After navigating an automated menu that made me question whether humanity deserves salvation, press 1 for landscaping violations, press 2 for noise complaints, press 3 if your house is literally falling apart. I was finally connected to Karen. Yes, her name was actually Karen. You can't make this stuff up. HOA office, Karen said in a tone that suggested she had been personally offended by my call. Hi, I began, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fact that drywall dust was still settling on my coffee table. I need to report some damage caused by the recent roof repairs your team arranged. Karen sighed audibly. What kind of damage? Well, I said, glancing up at the hole as if it might answer for me. There's a massive hole in my ceiling. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a pause so long and pregnant with indifference that it could have given birth to triplets. That doesn't sound like something we're responsible for, Karen finally said. Excuse me? My voice went up an octave. You hired the contractors who worked on the roof 6 months ago. They clearly botched something. Karen's tone shifted into what I can only describe as bureaucratic condescension. We'll need you to submit a formal complaint in writing along with photographic evidence. Fine, I snapped. Where should I send it? Oh, she said sweetly. You'll need to mail it to our office. Mail it? Like with stamps? Are we living in 1995? Karen ignored my sarcasm. Once we receive your complaint, we'll review it during our next monthly meeting. When's that? I asked. April 15th. It's March 20th. My voice cracked like a teenager's. Yes, Karen said cheerfully. Have a nice day. And just like that, she hung up. I stared at my phone in disbelief. This wasn't just negligence. This was weaponized incompetence. But if Karen thought she could outlast me in a battle of wills, she clearly underestimated how much free time I had and how much caffeine I could consume. Over the next few days, I transformed into a one-man investigative unit. Armed with my phone camera and an unhealthy amount of spite, I documented every angle of the hole. Close-ups of the jagged edges, wide shots showing its position relative to my furniture. Even an artistic black and white photo for dramatic effect, because why not? Then I dug through old emails until I found the original notice from the HOA about the roof repairs. The notice read, "We've hired top-notch roofing company to perform maintenance on all community roofs." A quick Google search revealed that top-notch roofing company had exactly 2 reviews, both 1-star, and one of them simply read, "Run." I compiled all this evidence into what can only be described as a PowerPoint presentation from hell and emailed it to Karen with the subject line, "Urgent. Your contractors broke my house." Her response? Another form letter thanking me for my patience while they investigated. Patience? Oh no, Karen. Patience left the building when the hole arrived. Fueled by righteous indignation and 3 cups of espresso, I took my case to social media. Within hours, my post, complete with photos of the hole and captions dripping with sarcasm, went viral among local residents. Comments poured in. "OMG, same thing happened to me. Their contractors are awful." Karen strikes again. "At least you don't have squirrels moving in through your hole." Yet, by day's end, #HOA fail was trending locally. The next morning, Karen called me. Not emailed, but called, which is how I knew things were getting serious. "We've reviewed your complaint," she said stiffly. "And," I asked, "we're sending someone out to inspect your property." Progress, or so I thought. When their so-called inspector arrived, a guy named Bob who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He spent all of 5 minutes looking at the hole before declaring it an act of God. Apparently, God had subcontracted top-notch roofing company. That's when it hit me. If this HOA wasn't going to fix the hole willingly, then by all that is petty and vindictive in this world, I'd make them regret ever crossing me. But that's another chapter entirely. When Bob the inspector left my house, muttering something about acts of God and how these things just happen, I stood there in my living room, staring up at the hole like it was mocking me. Acts of God? Really? If this was divine intervention, then God clearly had a grudge against suburban architecture. Or maybe he was just bored and decided to spice up my life. Either way, I wasn't buying it. I called Karen back. Yes, Karen. Again. By this point, she and I were practically pen pals, except instead of exchanging heartfelt letters, we were locked in a passive-aggressive death match over my ceiling. "Karen," I said, doing my best to sound calm even though my blood pressure was skyrocketing. "Bob came by and said this was an act of God." "That's correct," Karen replied in her usual tone of bureaucratic indifference. "Karen," I said, "if this is an act of God, then God must have subcontracted your roofing company because this hole didn't just appear out of nowhere. It's the result of shoddy work done by your contractors." "Well," Karen said, dragging out the word like she was savoring the sound of her own voice, "we can't be held responsible for what happens after the work is completed." "Karen," I interrupted, "the work was completed 6 months ago. There's a 1-year warranty on all repairs according to your own HOA bylaws." Silence. Sweet, glorious silence. For a moment I thought I'd won. But then Karen spoke again. "I'll have to check on that," she said. "Check on what?" I snapped. "It's in the bylaws. Page 12, Section 4. Do you want me to read it to you?" "No need for that," Karen said quickly. "We'll get back to you." And with that, she hung up. At this point, I realized Karen wasn't just incompetent. She was actively trying to wear me down. It was like some kind of psychological warfare. Delay tactics, vague responses, and just enough fake politeness to make me question whether I was overreacting. But I wasn't overreacting. My ceiling had a hole in it big enough to host a family of raccoons. So I did what any rational person would do when faced with an immovable object like Karen. I escalated. First, I went back to the HOA bylaws and highlighted every single clause that proved they were responsible for fixing the hole. Then I printed out copies, yes, copies, because if Karen wanted paperwork, oh boy, she was going to get paperwork. Next, I emailed the entire HOA board because surely someone on that committee had more common sense than Karen. Spoiler alert, they didn't. The board's response was even worse than Karen's. They claimed they needed more evidence before they could take any action. More evidence? What did they want? A live reenactment of the hole forming. But fine. If they wanted evidence, I'd give them evidence. I hired a structural engineer, a real one this time, not Bob, to inspect the damage and write up a report. His conclusion: the roof repairs had been done so poorly that parts of the structure were now compromised. In layman's terms, top-notch roofing company had turned my house into a ticking time bomb. Armed with this new report, I sent another email to the HOA board with the subject line, "Urgent. Your negligence is destroying my house." This time, I attached photos of the hole from every possible angle along with the engineer's report and a copy of the HOA bylaws, highlighted for their convenience. Their response? Another form letter thanking me for my patience while they reviewed the matter. Patience? Oh no, patience was gone. Patience had packed its bags and moved to another zip code. That's when I decided it was time to take things public. I started by posting about the hole on our neighborhood Facebook group, a cesspool of petty complaints and passive-aggressive comments that made high school drama look tame by comparison. My post included pictures of the hole along with a detailed account of my interactions with Karen and the HOA board. Within hours, it blew up. Neighbors started commenting with their own horror stories about the HOA. They fined me $100 for having weeds in my yard, but ignored my leaking roof for months. Karen once told me my mailbox wasn't aesthetically pleasing. What does that even mean? They hired top-notch roofing company? Those guys are terrible. They messed up my gutters last year. Apparently, top-notch roofing company's reputation, or lack thereof, was no secret in our community. One neighbor even claimed they'd caught one of their workers napping in their truck during a job. Fueled by righteous anger and an unhealthy amount of caffeine, again, I took things a step further. I created a website called HOAhorrors.com where people could share their own stories about dealing with incompetent HOAs. Within days, submissions started pouring in from all over the country. Stories about everything from arbitrary fines to outright corruption. Meanwhile, back in my neighborhood, things were heating up. My Facebook post had sparked a small rebellion against the HOA. Neighbors started attending board meetings en masse to demand accountability. Someone even made t-shirts that said, "Fix Mike's hole." Which, okay, maybe not the best phrasing. Karen wasn't happy about any of this. She called me one afternoon, probably hoping to intimidate me into backing down. But by this point, I was immune to her nonsense. "Mike," she began in her usual condescending tone, "we've received some complaints about your recent behavior." "My behavior?" I repeated incredulously. "Karen, there's a hole in my ceiling." "Well," she said stiffly, "we don't appreciate you spreading misinformation online." "Misinformation?" I laughed bitterly. "Karen, everything I've posted is backed up by photos and official reports. If you don't like people knowing about the hole, maybe you should fix it." There was a long pause before she finally replied, "We're working on it." Click. Victory? Not quite, but it was progress. Over the next few weeks, things continued to escalate. The HOA board finally agreed to hold an emergency meeting to address the hole, and probably also because half the neighborhood now hated them. At that meeting, which felt more like a courtroom drama than anything else, I presented all my evidence. Photos, reports, emails, everything. By the end of it, even Karen couldn't deny that they were responsible for fixing the hole. But as satisfying as it was to watch her squirm under pressure, well, let's just say this saga wasn't over yet. The emergency HOA meeting was held in the local community center, a place that usually hosted bake sales and yoga classes but now felt like the setting for a courtroom drama. The fluorescent lights buzzed ominously overhead as I walked in, armed with my trusty binder of evidence. I had everything: photos of the hole, the structural engineer's damning report, screenshots of my email exchanges with Karen, and even a printout of the HOA bylaws, highlighted and tabbed for maximum effect. If this were a movie, I'd be the scrappy underdog lawyer about to take on a corrupt corporation. Except instead of a corporation, it was Karen and her merry band of enablers. The room was packed. Word had spread about my fight with the HOA, and half the neighborhood had shown up to watch the spectacle. Some were there to support me, others were just there for the drama. Either way, I appreciated the audience. Nothing motivates an HOA quite like public humiliation. Karen sat at the head of the table, flanked by the other board members. She looked exactly how you'd expect someone named Karen to look. Perfectly coiffed hair, a blazer that screamed, "I'm in charge," and an expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. As I took my seat across from her, she gave me a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you all for coming," Karen began, her voice dripping with faux professionalism. "We're here to address Mr. Johnson's concerns regarding his property." "Concerns?" I interrupted. "Karen, it's not a concern. It's a hole in my ceiling, caused by your contractors." Karen ignored me and continued reading from her prepared statement, which was filled with phrases like due diligence and ongoing investigation. It was clear she was trying to stall for time, but I wasn't having it. "Let's cut to the chase," I said, standing up and holding up one of the photos of the hole like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom trial. "This is what we're dealing with. A giant hole in my ceiling that your contractors caused because they didn't do their job properly." Karen sighed audibly. "Mr. Johnson, as we've explained before." "No," I cut her off. "What you've explained before is nonsense. You tried to blame this on an act of God, but according to this report," I held up the structural engineer's findings, "the damage is directly linked to the shoddy work done by top-notch roofing company, which you hired." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. One neighbor even shouted, "Yeah, tell him Mike." Felt good to have backup. Karen's face turned an interesting shade of red as she shuffled her papers nervously. One of the other board members, a guy named Ted who looked like he'd been dragged here against his will, cleared his throat. "Well," Ted said hesitantly, "if there's evidence that the contractors were at fault, then maybe we should, address it?" Karen shot him a glare so icy it could have frozen water on contact. "We are addressing it," she snapped. "But these things take time." "How much time?" I demanded. "It's been weeks, Karen. Meanwhile, I'm living with a hole in my ceiling big enough to host a community theater production." That got a laugh from the crowd, which only seemed to irritate Karen further. "Mr. Johnson," she said through gritted teeth, "we understand your frustration." "Do you?" I interrupted again. "Because if you did, you'd be doing something about it instead of sitting here making excuses." At this point, another neighbor chimed in. "Why don't we just hire a new contractor and fix it already? This is ridiculous." Karen looked like she was about to explode. Clearly, she wasn't used to being challenged like this. But before she could respond, another board member, a woman named Linda who seemed slightly more reasonable, spoke up. "Maybe we should consider hiring an independent contractor to assess the damage and provide an estimate for repairs," Linda suggested. "That's exactly what I've been saying," I exclaimed, throwing my hands up in exasperation. Karen glared at Linda but reluctantly agreed to put it to a vote. Unsurprisingly, most of the board sided with Linda and me, which meant Karen was officially outnumbered. Victory tasted sweet, though not as sweet as it would have been if they'd just fixed the hole weeks ago without all this drama. But of course, this is an HOA we're talking about, so nothing is ever simple. The next day, Karen sent me an email informing me that they'd hired yet another inspector to assess the damage before moving forward with repairs. This inspector, let's call him Frank, showed up 2 days later wearing khakis that were 2 sizes too big and carrying a clipboard like it was some kind of magical artifact. Frank spent all of 10 minutes looking at the hole before declaring that it would require extensive repairs. No kidding, Frank. That's what happens when someone leaves a gaping wound in your ceiling for weeks on end. When I asked him how long it would take to fix, he shrugged and said something vague about supply chain issues and labor shortages. Translation: don't hold your breath. Still, progress was progress, or so I thought. A week later, Karen emailed me again to inform me that they'd received Frank's report but needed additional quotes from other contractors before proceeding with repairs. At this point, I was convinced they were just messing with me for fun. But then something miraculous happened. One of my neighbors, a retired lawyer named Susan, offered to help me draft a formal legal complaint against the HOA. Susan had been quietly following my saga from afar and decided enough was enough. With Susan's help, we sent Karen and the board a letter threatening legal action if they didn't start repairs immediately. And wouldn't you know it, that finally got their attention. Within 48 hours, contractors were at my house patching up the hole like their lives depended on it. It took them 3 days to finish the job, a job that should have been done weeks ago. But when they were done, my ceiling was finally whole again, pun intended. As satisfying as it was to have the hole fixed, I couldn't help but feel annoyed by how much effort it had taken just to get basic repairs done. But hey, that's life under an HOA, where common sense goes to die and bureaucracy reigns supreme. Still, at least now I had one hell of a story to tell at neighborhood barbecues. When the contractors finally packed up their tools and left, I stood in my living room staring at my newly repaired ceiling like it was a masterpiece in the Louvre. The hole was gone, patched, painted, and smoothed over as if it had never existed. But the scars? Oh, those were still there. Not on the ceiling, mind you, but on my soul. Weeks of battling Karen and her HOA minions had left me with a newfound appreciation for the phrase, death by bureaucracy. Sure, my ceiling was fixed, but at what cost? I'd aged 10 years in the span of a month, developed a caffeine addiction that could rival a college student during finals week, and lost all faith in humanity, or at least in anyone named Karen. But hey, at least Mr. Whiskers could finally sit on the couch without fearing for his life. Small victories. Now, you'd think this was the end of the story, right? The hole was fixed, justice had been served, sort of, and I could finally move on with my life. But no, because this is an HOA we're talking about. A group of people who seem to derive joy from making your life as inconvenient as humanly possible. 2 days after the repairs were completed, I received an email from Karen. Naturally, I opened it with the same level of dread one might feel when opening a jury summons. Dear Mr. Johnson, it began, already off to a bad start. Karen never calls me Mike. We've reviewed your recent repair situation and would like to remind you that any structural changes to your property must be approved by the HOA board prior to commencement. I blinked at the screen in disbelief. Structural changes? What structural changes? They were fixing their mistake. Karen continued, while we understand this repair was necessary, we kindly ask that you submit a retroactive application for approval so we can update our records accordingly. A retroactive application? For fixing the hole they caused? At this point, I couldn't tell if Karen was genuinely clueless or just trying to troll me. I replied with what I thought was a reasonable email. Karen, this wasn't a structural change. It was a repair caused by negligence on the part of your contractors. If you'd like me to submit an application for approval, please forward me the form along with instructions on how to retroactively approve something that shouldn't have required approval in the first place. Her response? Another form letter thanking me for my cooperation and attaching a 12-page document titled Application for Structural Modifications. 12 pages. For a whole repair. I printed out the form and stared at it like it was some kind of cruel joke. It asked for everything: blueprints for a patch job, contractor licenses, which they hired, and even an explanation of how the repair would impact community aesthetics. Community aesthetics? Karen, it's a ceiling. No one's hosting an art exhibit up there. But fine. If Karen wanted paperwork, I'd give her paperwork. I filled out every single section of that ridiculous form with as much sarcasm as I could muster. Blueprints * a hand-drawn sketch of the hole labeled before and after. Contractor license * a copy of top-notch roofing company Yelp reviews. Spoiler, still 1 star. Impact on community aesthetics * the repair restores my ceiling to its original state, which is objectively more aesthetically pleasing than having a giant hole. I scanned it all into one PDF and emailed it back with the subject line, retroactive approval for your mistake. Karen's response? Another email thanking me for my submission and informing me that it would be reviewed at the next board meeting, which wasn't for another 3 weeks. At this point, I realized Karen wasn't just incompetent. She was vindictive. But if she thought she could out-petty me, she clearly underestimated just how far I was willing to go. Over those 3 weeks, I became that neighbor, the one who rallies everyone against the HOA like some kind of suburban Robin Hood. I shared my story with anyone who would listen. At barbecues, during dog walks, even at the local grocery store while waiting in line for deli meat. And you know what? People started sharing their own HOA horror stories. They fined me $75 because my garden gnome wasn't regulation size. Karen told me my fence color was too aggressive. They sent me a warning letter because my car looked dusty. It turns out Karen wasn't just bad at her job. She was universally despised. And once people realized she tried to make me submit paperwork for fixing her mistake, oh boy, the neighborhood revolt began. By the time the next board meeting rolled around, half the community showed up demanding answers. Not just about the hole, but about everything else Karen had mismanaged over the years. It was glorious chaos. Neighbors shouting over each other, waving warning letters in the air like protest signs, and demanding Karen's resignation. Karen tried to keep her composure. She really did, but even she couldn't withstand the sheer force of suburban outrage. By the end of the meeting, she announced she'd be stepping down as HOA president due to personal reasons. Personal reasons? Karen, we all know you were voted off Suburbia Island. With Karen gone and a new board elected, led by Linda, bless her reasonable soul, things finally started looking up. The new board promised to review all HOA policies and even issued an apology letter for how my situation had been handled. As for me, well, let's just say I'm not done yet. I've started documenting every ridiculous HOA rule and sharing them online under #HOA horrors. Did you know some HOAs ban pink flamingos because they're too whimsical? Or that others require you to get approval before planting flowers in your own yard? It's absurd and people love it. So here's my advice. If you're dealing with an HOA nightmare like mine, don't back down. Fight tooth and nail for what's right. Even if it means filling out 12 pages of nonsense forms or rallying your neighbors like you're leading a revolution. And hey, if you enjoyed hearing about my battle against the hole and Karen, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, comment below with your own HOA horror stories, and subscribe to my channel for more suburban chaos. Together, we can take down these petty tyrants one ridiculous rule at a time.